In PowerPoint, we're going to discuss the legislative branch that was created by Article 1 of the Constitution. And remember, the Constitution has 7 articles, and Article 1 is where we find the information related to the creation of the legislative branch of our government. The legislative branch is the branch that makes the laws, the people that write the laws of our country. And it is made up of a lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and an upper house, the United States Senate. We're also going to talk in this PowerPoint about the process of legislating, the functions of lawmakers that go beyond writing laws. There are many, many of those functions. I'm going to talk about the power of Congress, the things that the Constitution says that the Congress can write laws about. That's obviously very important. And then we're going to talk about the way that the Supreme Court has interpreted a particular part of this document, the Commerce Clause within the powers of Congress, to expand their areas in which they are able to write laws. The House of Representatives is the lower house of our two-house legislature. The qualifications for being a member of the lower house are you have to be at least 25 years old and you are elected every 2 years. As you can see from that, in particular, the fact that they're elected every 2 years by people within the districts that they live, these people are very sensitive to what people think because they are no longer, it's not soon after, very soon after they are elected and take office, they actually have to begin running again for re-election. So they're constantly sensitive to what the people in their district think, and they are also therefore the more democratic element of our legislation, our legislative branch. The lower house, the House of Representatives, has special powers and functions. Any bills to tax people in this country have to originate in the House. The upper house cannot start a bill about taxation. It must start in the lower house, and articles of impeachment against the president must originate in the lower house, in this particular house. The United States Senate is the upper house of our legislature, the other part of our bicameral legislature. You have to be at least 30 years of age to be a member of the United States Senate. And originally, under our Constitution, senators were not elected. They were appointed by the state that they lived in, and they were appointed for a 6-year term. Now, right here, you see the big difference between these two parts of our Congress. Senators had to be a little older. They weren't elected. They were appointed. They served a much longer term. So right there, you understand that the Founding Fathers had an idea that the House of Representatives, part of it should be very democratic. It should be people that are motivated by what the people think. That's the House of Representatives. And part of it should be kind of above the democracy, above the interests of constituents, not even elected people, people that serve 6-year terms. So they're not really worried about popular opinion. So they can kind of think more in terms of what's best for the country. Notice the balancing that's going on here with creating very, very different branches or very different parts, houses of our legislative branch of government. The United States Senate has special powers and functions. Well, I should say before I leave this other point that we no longer appoint senators. We amended our Constitution about 100 years ago to say that senators would be elected by the people, so they're no longer appointed. The special powers and functions of the United States Senate. It is the Senate that approves all presidential appointments. When the president appoints a Secretary of State or an Attorney General or someone like that, they have to go before the Senate to be approved. president can't just put people in positions. The Senate has to sign off on it. They also sign. President appoints Supreme Court justices. The Senate has to approve. They also approve treaties that the president negotiates with other countries, and they are the jury in an impeachment trial. The House brings the charges against the president if we decide to remove a president, and the Senate is the jury. The Supreme Court Chief Justice acts as the judge. A very interesting thing. Again, the checks and balances that exist within this system. There are some very interesting rules that the Senate has that are kind of unique to the Senate. The Senate is supposed to be a body in which people can have unlimited debate, and so one of the rules that exists in the within the United States Senate is the filibuster and closure rules. Filibustering is the ability of someone just to stand up and keep talking as long as they want to prolong something so a vote can't be held. So if there's something before the Senate, and let's say there's 100 senators and 55 senators think it's a great idea, one of those 45 that disagree can filibuster. He can get up, or a group of them can get up and just talk and talk and talk. And as long as they keep talking, no vote can be held. This is a way to get the other side, get the majority to give up. But filibustering can be brought to an end if 60 senators agree to what's called a cloture vote, which means that a filibuster must be brought to an end. So it's basically useful if between 51 and 59 senators want to do something and the rest want to block it. But if 60 senators want to do something, cloture vote could be called, and the matter can be brought to a vote. Process of legislating is very important for us to understand this process. We're going to talk about it, the different pieces of it, for just a second here. What happens in legislating and writing a law? Essentially, a bill has to be presented before an idea becomes a law. It's called a bill. And a bill has to be introduced in Congress in one of the houses. And so let's say a bill is introduced in the House of Representatives. Interesting that, you think, what's the process of this? Well, in the House of Representatives, there's what's called a hopper, and it's kind of like a container, and members of Congress take a bill that they think is important and they want to support, and they put it in the hopper. That's how a bill is introduced into Congress. That bill is then numbered, and it's sent off to an appropriate committee. There are many, many committees within both houses of Congress, and a committee that would look at this particular piece of legislation that would be experts on this area. So if it's defense related, it would be sent to a committee that deals with defense issue. If it's something that has to do with healthcare, it will be sent to a committee that deals with that. If it's something that has to do with, let's say, Social Security, or welfare, would go that direction. If it's highways, it would go towards the Transportation Committee. So it'd be sent to a committee, and then a committee would look at it for a period of time, and then decide, well, maybe there should be a subcommittee. And they may organize a special committee, and they would have hearings, and they would get information, and they would do research. They would educate themselves on this particular measure and on whether or not it is useful. Here's the thing that's real important. There's an incredible number of bills that are introduced in Congress. Very few ever get to step 3 here on our list, which is floor debate and vote. Most of them die right in the committee subcommittee phase. To get out of the committee subcommittee phase, the committee itself has to vote it forward to be debated and voted on on the floor of the House. Most bills die right in the committee phase. Often bills are what we call pigeonholed. That means they're just kind of set aside, and they never ever make it out of committee. Um, most bills die right in the committee phase. If you can get out of the committee with your bill, it will be sent to the floor for debate and voting. Bills that are successfully voted out of committee go to the floor. Very few bills actually ever get to the floor. After the debate, the House, whichever House it's in, will vote on the measure by a simple majority vote. If it passes by a simple majority vote, it's considered passed by that particular House. Now, that's not the end, though, because this entire process must be repeated or completed in the other house as well. So once you have a bill passed in one house, it's sent to the other house for consideration. Sometimes bills will be considered at the same time, but by the time they get through, they have lots of amendments and changes. Once it goes through the other house, if it's not exactly the same as the bill that went through the first house, it has to go to what's called a conference committee, which will look at it. The members of both houses will be together in this conference committee, and they will look at this piece of legislation, and they will come to some kind of compromise on which bill to take, or they would kind of take pieces of each other. And then after that, it has to go through both houses again, because the only way a bill can ever be moved forward is if both houses pass it with the exact same vote with the exact same wording, which is actually very complicated to accomplish. If you can make it through this entire process with a piece of legislation, both houses, same wording, through the whole process, it's sent to the president. The president can sign the legislation and make it law, or the president can veto it and kill it right there. And if the president vetoes it, the only thing that can make it go into law is if the Congress overrides. And then Congress to override has to have a 2/3 majority in both houses to override, which is incredibly difficult. So when you look at this process, it is a long, tedious, slow process. It is very clear that the founding fathers were more afraid of government acting rashly and writing laws rashly than they were in having the government act too slow. Sometimes we get very frustrated the government's acting too slow, but you have to understand it was designed. It was designed in such a way that laws would take time to make and approve. The legislative branch, the lawmakers that are there, not only do they make law, that they have other functions. As we talked about in the first week of the course, their primary function is to resolve conflict. That's why government exists. That's what we're doing in politics. We're resolving conflict. Well, in their case, they make laws, as we've already talked about. They also, though, represent a specific group of people in government, and they have to think about those people in their lawmaking capacity. They also provide services to constituents, all types of things. If you run into trouble with the federal government, you'll want to talk to your representative and get their assistance. They provide oversight to other parts of our government. Um, Congressional committees provide oversight of the president, the judiciary, the Defense Department, all kinds of things. And they also educate people on what they're doing and what other parts of the government are doing as well. So you can see this is a large number of things, a lot of responsibilities for people. They have to stay in Washington a certain period of time. They have to be at home a certain period of time. Pretty complicated thing, list of things to carry out. Under our Article 1, there are a number of powers that are delegated to Congress. In Article 1, Section 8, I really suggest you go to the Constitution and read this yourself. It is more complicated than what I'm presenting here, but I'm just kind of breaking it down as simple as I can for you to understand that basically Congress has the power under Article 1, Section 8 to tax and borrow money, to defend the country, to naturalize citizens, to enforce laws and govern federal property, to have a post office, and to regulate commerce internationally and among the states. Notice this isn't on an extensive list. It's pretty short. And notice also that the government today does many things that are not on this list. So, two very important phrases within Article 1, Section 8, with regard to powers delegated to Congress, the phrase necessary and proper and the phrase general welfare. Necessary and proper is at the end of this section. It says that Congress shall have the power to pass laws that are necessary and proper to carry out the other powers. And this has often been referred to as the Elastic Clause, which gives Congress the power to go into a whole bunch of other areas that aren't specifically listed here and argue that essentially we have to do this in order to carry out the other powers. The issue of the national bank is a great example. Jefferson has some really good things to say about this and raising questions about actually the word necessary and comparing it to the word convenient. But that necessary and proper clause, very, very important in the extension of government power. And also then the general welfare phrase, which is within the power to tax, basically is a qualification on taxation, saying the government can only tax if it's for the general welfare of the people. People have changed this application of this phrase to argue that government can do anything that is for the general welfare of the people, and that certainly would suggest then that this list itself is no longer important, but that the only question is the government action being taken for the general welfare of the people? So these are two very important phrases. We're going to talk more about them in the course that have been used to greatly expand government power and to go beyond this the very limited list of powers that are delegated to Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So with regard to the legislative branch, there are also in the Constitution restrictions on the legislative branch, and there also is this concept of reserved powers. Article 1, Section 9 has a list of restricted powers, things that Congress can't do. Congress can't suspend habeas corpus, which is the right to trial by jury. Congress can't pass a bill of attainder, which is to convict somebody of a crime without a trial. Congress can't pass an ex post facto law, which is a law that makes something illegal after it was the action was committed and then prosecute somebody for it. Can't do a capitation tax, which is our modern income tax, and that was of course repealed by that restriction was repealed by Amendment number 16, so that we could have an income tax. They can't do direct taxes like real estate taxes. They can't tax exports out of the country. Congress can't grant a title of nobility. And then in Amendment 10 to the Constitution, we have this concept of powers reserved for the states, that if powers are not delegated in the Constitution to the Congress, they are reserved for the states. And it's very important to understand that the founding fathers wanted to give Congress a limited list of powers. They wanted to restrict those powers in significant ways. And they also wanted to say that if the power has not been delegated to Congress, that it is reserved for the states or for the people. They want to make that clear, that we didn't want to reverse that and think that if they forgot to say something or something's missing here, that it actually is a congressional power, a national government power. That is not what they wanted to say. They wanted to clearly say that powers not delegated are reserved to the states. Now we're going to take a second and look at the Commerce Clause interpretation. I'm not going to do a whole lot with this. I'm just going to highlight some things that I want you to look at in understanding that the use of the Commerce Clause has been a very, very important way that the government has increased its powers. There are 4 court cases that you should be familiar with. The Gibbons case, in which the government got the power to regulate trade on rivers. Swift and Company, which established the stream of commerce doctrine. West Coast Hotel, which gave the government the right to establish minimum wage laws. And the Heart of Atlanta Motel case, which gave the government the right to regulate service industries. This was the case in which the civil rights case in which the government came in and said that that hiring practices and who you serve in your hotel or motel or restaurant is something the government can have a say in. Now, why this is important is if you look at the legislative branch over time, how have we spent money? This chart, I think, is very profound. If you look at the bottom of this chart, you see the numbers 1800, 1820, 1840. That's the years, dating all the way back to 1790. If you look across, all the way across to 2000, 2010. The up and down part of this graph or chart is billions of dollars that we spend a year. So the first line there is 500 billion a year, 1,000 billion, which would be $1 trillion a year, all the way up to 4,000 billion or $4 trillion a year. If you notice, up until the 1940s, there's barely anything that appears here. The government was spending far less than $500 billion a year. In some cases, less than $100 billion a year for most of our history. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you see the increase of government spending to the point now that we're spending $3.5 trillion a year. What I want you to understand is a lot of people are concerned today. How did that happen? How did we spend all of this money? This conversation that we're having today really lays out the foundation of how that happened. It is the increase in power in the legislative branch of the government to be able to make laws in all kinds of areas that the government was not given the power to do in the original Constitution. What are the ways this has happened? The General Welfare Clause. The expansion of national power has occurred because of three things that we've talked about already and some other things that we're going to talk about in the future. But for now, that General Welfare Clause. We have Social Security today because it says right at the beginning that this act is for the general welfare of the people. This idea that Congress can pass any law that's for our good or deemed for our good really eliminates the whole reason for the list of powers that are in the Constitution itself. The necessary and proper clause has been put in the Constitution, uh, to, was in the Constitution, has been interpreted to mean that we have a national bank, and for a time we had a national bank, and that we have the ability to interpret the Commerce Clause very broadly, so that we can interpret the Commerce Clause in a way that changes how we view that clause and how we view the government's ability to get involved in business. Commerce Clause itself, we've used that uh, to do healthcare, to do minimum wage laws, to do labor laws. The Department of Education comes out of interpretation of the Commerce Clause because you have to have an educated workforce. This broadening of the Commerce Clause to say instead of just international commerce and interstate commerce, now the stream of commerce doctrine that we approved in Swift, that the judicial branch upheld in Swift and Company, says that anything that ends up in another state is in the stream of commerce doctrine, and the government then can regulate that. All of these things, massive amounts of legislation, regulation of food, regulation of medicine, involvement in healthcare, all of these things have come from taking that Commerce Clause, which said that the government of the United States, which really was intended to have the government of the United States create a free flowing economic system of trade within the states. The idea was you could go from Pennsylvania to Florida and sell something and freely go and transport things through the country and have no issue whatsoever. What we've done is reverse that, and we've given the government the power to regulate commerce. Instead of Instead of allowing it to be free, the governments use that power to flip on the other side of the conversation and say, oh, we can have healthcare, we can regulate food, we can regulate medicines, we can do meat inspection, we can have a Department of Education, all kinds of things that come out of the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And again, I suggest that you look at those court cases to understand, on the previous slide, to understand exactly how that occurred. But the big picture is the most important thing, and understanding that these words, these things that are already in the Constitution, which maybe meant one thing by the founding fathers when they were written, have been interpreted in a different way um, over time. And as a result, think of that chart that we just looked at. We see the massive government spending and the massive expansion of national power that has occurred.